March 23, 1945. Before dawn, along the western bank of the Rhine, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery stood inside his command caravan, staring at maps that had consumed months of his life. Outside, the river lay dark and wide, moving slowly under a cold spring sky. This was the moment he had planned for since Normandy, the crossing that would be remembered as his masterpiece. Operation Plunder was ready. More than 1 million Allied troops were poised along the river. Thousands of artillery pieces waited in silence. Airborne divisions were preparing to drop from the sky in one of the largest coordinated assaults of the war. For Montgomery, this was not just another operation. It was the culmination of his philosophy: overwhelming force, absolute preparation, no room for chance. He believed history rewarded certainty. Montgomery was calm, outwardly. To those around him, he projected confidence, even inevitability. The Rhine was Germany's last great natural barrier. Once crossed in force, the war in Europe would be over. And when that happened, Montgomery expected the world to remember one thing clearly: he had broken Hitler's final line. Then the radio crackled. At first, the message seemed routine. A report from American headquarters. But as the word settled into the cramped command space, the air changed. General George S. Patton's Third Army had already crossed the Rhine. Not tomorrow. Not as part of Operation Plunder. But hours earlier, quietly, swiftly, without announcement. For a moment, Montgomery said nothing. He read the message again. Then a third time. Patton had crossed near Oppenheim. No massive artillery barrage. No airborne spectacle. Just engineers, assault boats, and speed. German resistance had been light, almost non-existent. The bridgehead was already secure. The crossing Montgomery had spent months preparing for was no longer the first. Inside his mind, disbelief collided with anger. This was not supposed to happen. The Rhine was his stage. Eisenhower had approved plunder as the main event, the decisive blow. Patton was meant to wait, supporting, not stealing the moment. Yet Patton had done what he always did. He moved. To understand why this moment cut so deeply, one must understand Bernard Montgomery. He was not reckless. He was not impulsive. He believed wars were won by preparation, not inspiration. Every operation he commanded was rehearsed, refined, and shielded from uncertainty. His victories were designed to be inevitable. Patton represented everything Montgomery distrusted. Where Montgomery saw caution as responsibility, Patton saw it as delay. Where Montgomery demanded permission, Patton trusted instinct. And now, in the war's final weeks, that difference had exploded into the open. Outside Montgomery's headquarters, the machinery of Operation Plunder continued. Guns were still silent, planes still grounded. No one else yet knew that history had shifted in the dark hours before dawn. Montgomery understood the implications immediately. This wasn't just about tactics. It was about narrative. In war, battles are fought with weapons, but legacies are shaped by timing. Whoever crossed the Rhine first would be remembered as the general who shattered Germany's last defense. And Patton had done it without asking. Across the river, the German army was collapsing. Units were under strength, command structures shattered by months of bombing and retreat. Patton had sensed it. He had felt the weakness in the enemy line long before Allied planners acknowledged it on their maps. That intuition, dangerous, brilliant, infuriating, had paid off again. As Montgomery absorbed the news, his staff waited for orders. They saw no explosion of rage, no shouted protest. Montgomery was disciplined enough for that. Instead, his reaction was quieter and more revealing. He straightened. He adjusted his beret. Operation Plunder would go ahead as planned. If Patton wanted speed, Montgomery would answer with scale. But inside, something had fractured. Because this was not the first time Patton had stolen momentum. In North Africa, in Sicily, again and again, Patton had surged ahead while Montgomery prepared. Each time, the rivalry deepened. Each time, the question returned: was Patton reckless, or simply right? Montgomery had always believed that history would side with him in the end. That planners outlast gamblers. That caution survives bravado. Yet here, on the banks of the Rhine, history had moved without waiting. Far to the south, Patton himself was reportedly grinning when he heard the news spreading through Allied command. He had crossed one of Europe's great rivers under enemy eyes, and lived to tell the story. Later, he would brag that he had crossed the Rhine with less difficulty than crossing the Hudson. Montgomery would never forgive that line. As dawn approached, Allied aircraft finally began to move. Operation Plunder roared to life with thunder and fire, exactly as planned. Paratroopers filled the sky. Artillery lit the horizon. It was a triumph by every military measure. But the silence before dawn had already rewritten the story. Montgomery knew it. From this moment on, every success would be measured against what Patton had already done. Every headline would carry an unspoken comparison. The Rhine, once a symbol of German defiance, had become a mirror, reflecting two commanders, two philosophies, and one irreversible truth. The war was ending. And Bernard Montgomery had just realized that history does not always reward those who wait. The river had been crossed. March 24, 1945. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, was already awake when the news arrived in full. Phones rang across the corridors. Maps were unrolled, marked, and marked again. Somewhere between disbelief and urgency, the reality settled in. Patton had not only crossed the Rhine, he had done it cleanly. General Dwight D. Eisenhower stood over a large operations map, hands resting on the table, eyes fixed on the thin blue line that had dominated Allied planning for months. The Rhine was no longer a barrier. It was a crossed-out obstacle. Eisenhower was not surprised by Patton's audacity. What unsettled him was the timing. Patton had acted without explicit authorization. Technically, the crossing was premature. Strategically, it was brilliant. The German defenses in that sector had been thinner than intelligence suggested. Prisoners were surrendering in groups. Units were dissolving rather than fighting. Success had arrived before permission. For Eisenhower, this was not a personal rivalry, it was a command crisis. He had spent years balancing egos as carefully as armies. Montgomery demanded recognition and structure. Patton demanded freedom and momentum. Both had delivered victories. Both believed they deserved the final word. And now Eisenhower had to decide how history, and the war, would move forward. Reports from Patton's Third Army grew more confident by the hour. Engineers had expanded the bridgehead. Armor was already crossing pontoon bridges. German counterattacks were weak, disorganized, almost symbolic. The enemy was no longer defending Germany, they were trying to survive it. Eisenhower understood what this meant. If Patton was allowed to exploit the breach fully, he could outrun not only the Germans, but Allied plans themselves. Entire sectors could collapse before Montgomery's carefully staged assault even finished unfolding. And yet, stopping Patton now would be unforgivable. Eisenhower turned away from the map. He had been a soldier long enough to recognize momentum when he saw it. War punished hesitation more severely than disobedience. Patton had taken a risk, but it was paying off in lives saved and territory gained. Still, Eisenhower knew the political consequences would be severe. Montgomery would be furious. The British press had already invested in Operation Plunder as the final triumph of British arms. Churchill had expected it. London had prepared for it. And now an American general, one already notorious for insubordination, had stolen the opening act. Late that night, Eisenhower dictated his response. There would be no public reprimand. Instead, Patton's crossing would be folded quietly into the broader Allied narrative. Officially, the Rhine would be described as having been crossed along multiple sectors. No single commander would be credited, at least not immediately. Privately, Eisenhower sent Patton a message that was as restrained as it was revealing. He congratulated him, but he also reminded him, firmly, that future operations must remain coordinated. This was not a rebuke. It was a warning. Patton had been allowed to win, but he would not be allowed to rewrite the chain of command. Patton, for his part, understood the message perfectly. He had won the moment. That was enough. As dawn broke on March 24th, Eisenhower received further reports from Montgomery's sector. Operation Plunder was proceeding successfully. Airborne troops had landed. Bridges were being secured. The Rhine was falling everywhere. On paper, everything was perfect. In reality, the war's tempo had shifted. Eisenhower sensed it. The German army was not retreating, it was dissolving. Entire towns were surrendering without resistance. Civilians flooded roads waving white cloths. The fear that had once fueled fanatic defense was giving way to exhaustion and inevitability. This was no longer a battle for lines on a map. It was a race to end the war. And Patton was winning that race. For Eisenhower, leadership now meant restraint rather than control. He resisted the temptation to pull Patton back. He resisted the pressure to elevate Montgomery publicly at Patton's expense. Instead, he did what he had done throughout the war. He let success continue, even when it disrupted the plan. History, he knew, would sort out the credit later. That night, Eisenhower wrote in his private notes that the Rhine crossing had confirmed what he already suspected: Germany was finished. Not weeks from now. Not months. Days. The final phase of the war in Europe had begun, not with thunder, but with a quiet crossing that no one had authorized and no one could undo. As Patton's tanks rolled eastward and Montgomery's guns roared to life, Eisenhower stood between two generals, two philosophies, and one irreversible truth. The war was moving faster than any plan. And there was no stopping it now. March 25, 1945. The roads of central Germany were choked, not with resistance, but with surrender. As Patton's Third Army poured through the Rhine breach, the expected counterattacks never came. Instead, German soldiers emerged from forests, barns, and ruined towns with hands raised, helmets dropped, weapons discarded in the mud. This was not defeat in battle. This was collapse. Patton moved as if he could feel it in his bones. He drove his commanders relentlessly, pressing them forward day and night. "Keep going," he told them. "There's nothing in front of us but frightened men and open roads." And he was right. German units were fragmenting faster than Allied intelligence could track them. Villages fell without a shot. Bridges were captured intact. Supply depots were abandoned, their contents left behind by units that no longer believed in victory or survival. Patton's speed was merciless. To the soldiers advancing east, the war felt surreal. After years of brutal fighting, Normandy hedgerows, the killing fields of the Ardennes, the enemy had simply evaporated. Some Americans joked that they were chasing ghosts. Others felt something colder: unease. Because when an army stops fighting, it often means it is hiding something worse. Behind Patton's columns, evidence began to surface. First, it was small things: burned documents, hurriedly abandoned camps, rail sidings leading nowhere. Then came the survivors. They emerged slowly, like figures from another world. Starved men in striped uniforms. Women too weak to stand. Eyes that no longer reacted to sound or movement. Some tried to speak. Others simply stared. Patton had liberated camps before. He knew what he was seeing. But this was different. The camps Patton's forces encountered were not battlefields. They were factories of disappearance. The smell reached the soldiers before the sight did: sweet, metallic, impossible to forget. Piles of bodies lay where guards had fled too quickly to hide them. Crematoriums still warm. Records half-burned. The war had not only been about territory. It had been about this. Patton's anger deepened. He ordered his troops to document everything. Photographs. Testimonies. Names. Nothing was to be destroyed. Nothing was to be ignored. The truth, he believed, had to be carried forward at the same speed as his tanks. Meanwhile, Montgomery advanced more methodically to the north, achieving success through sheer force and coordination. His armies crushed remaining German resistance along the lower Rhine. His operation was flawless, exactly as planned. Yet it was Patton's advance that dominated Allied headquarters. Because Patton was no longer just winning battles. He was exposing the lie. Eisenhower received reports that shook him. The camps were worse than anyone had imagined. Worse than intelligence estimates. Worse than rumors. He understood immediately that the end of the war would not be defined only by surrender documents or parades, but by what the Allies forced the world to see. Orders went out across all commands. Every camp would be preserved. Every civilian nearby would be brought to witness what had been done in their name. This was no longer military necessity. It was moral obligation. As Patton pushed deeper into Germany, the landscape changed. Medieval towns stood untouched, their churches intact, their homes occupied by families who claimed ignorance. White flags appeared everywhere. Civilians insisted they were victims too. Patton did not argue. He simply kept moving. The shadow of what his army was uncovering stretched longer with each mile. Germany was not just losing a war, it was losing the ability to deny it had ever happened. By the end of March, the question was no longer whether Germany would surrender. It was how much truth would surface before it did. Patton sensed the weight of it. Victory had lost its triumph. Speed had become a burden. Every road led to another revelation, another camp, another reminder that the war's deepest crimes had not been committed at the front lines, but behind them. The Rhine crossing had opened the gates. What lay beyond was something far darker. April 1, 1945. As the Third Army surged eastward across Germany, the contrast between Patton and Montgomery could not have been starker. Montgomery's forces, advancing along the northern corridor, were disciplined, methodical, and precise. Every artillery barrage was calculated. Every movement rehearsed. Every bridge secured before any vehicle dared to cross. His headquarters resembled a chessboard, with pieces moved according to long-term strategy rather than impulse. Patton, by contrast, operated on instinct, audacity, and the relentless pressure of momentum. To him, hesitation was deadly, delay a luxury the enemy could not afford. Where Montgomery would pause to ensure perfection, Patton would strike, improvise, and adapt on the move. Tanks rolled through towns before the bridges were fully secured. Reconnaissance units scouted by daylight. And, as always, the press followed, the spectacle impossible to ignore. It was during this period that the rivalry reached its most personal phase. British correspondents sent glowing dispatches about Montgomery's achievements, the airborne landings, the enormous force concentration, the meticulous planning that had guaranteed success at the Lower Rhine. Yet American journalists were equally relentless in highlighting Patton's daring. A single night crossing at Oppenheim, minimal artillery support, and a bridgehead established in hours. Montgomery read these reports in private with growing frustration. His carefully constructed image as Britain's supreme commander seemed to unravel before his eyes. The timing of Patton's successes, and the media's emphasis on them, felt like an intentional provocation. "Every step he takes, he steals the glory," Montgomery remarked to his chief of staff. "And the world seems to cheer him on." Meanwhile, Patton's officers were acutely aware of the psychological stakes. Each operation, each bold maneuver, was as much about achieving military objectives as it was about shaping perception. Speed and audacity were not just tactics, they were instruments of legacy. By April 3, Patton had crossed the main river, outflanking German positions that had been expected to hold for weeks. His troops captured thousands of prisoners and liberated dozens of villages. Yet, amid the victory, he remained focused, calculating the next objective. Delay, in his philosophy, was an invitation for disaster. Success had to be continuous, overwhelming, and visible. Montgomery's army, moving more cautiously, secured critical terrain in northern Germany and prepared for the advance toward the industrial Ruhr. The meticulous planning ensured minimal casualties and maximum efficiency, but the headlines increasingly favored Patton's dramatic advances. American newspapers highlighted the speed, the daring, and the symbolic gestures that made Patton's troops appear unstoppable. Montgomery's accomplishments, though substantial, were overshadowed in the public eye. Tensions reached a subtle peak during a joint briefing with Eisenhower. Reports from both fronts arrived simultaneously. Eisenhower listened, a diplomat in uniform, parsing data and managing egos. He praised both commanders publicly, emphasizing the strategic necessity of each operation. Yet privately, he acknowledged to his staff that Patton's style, aggressive, visible, and sensational, had captured global attention in ways that Monty's disciplined, measured approach never could. By mid-April, Patton's forces were approaching the Elbe River. With each crossing, he demonstrated an uncanny ability to exploit the enemy's disarray, turning German collapse into operational advantage. Towns surrendered before he arrived. Trains loaded with retreating troops were intercepted. Logistics, supply lines, and communications, once barriers to rapid advance, were now tools Patton used to accelerate victory. Montgomery's northern advance, meanwhile, focused on consolidating gains, securing flanks, and preparing for the final push into the Ruhr. His operations were textbook examples of military science. Units moved in coordination. Artillery barrages were precise. Bridges and supply lines were secured before crossing rivers. Every detail was accounted for. Yet, as the Allies celebrated Patton's spectacle, Montgomery's painstaking methodology seemed almost invisible to the public. Despite the stark contrast, the two commanders shared a grudging respect. Each understood the other's strengths and limitations. Montgomery admired Patton's audacity, even if he considered it reckless. Patton acknowledged the value of Montgomery's meticulous preparation, though he found it frustratingly slow. Their rivalry, intense and often personal, had propelled both men and their armies toward extraordinary achievements. April 15, 1945, marked the culmination of this chapter of the campaign. Patton's Third Army had carved a swath through southern and central Germany, liberating towns and exposing the full scale of Nazi atrocities. Montgomery's forces had secured the north, positioned for the drive into the Ruhr, and maintained operational stability in a region critical to the Allied advance. Both operations were strategically successful, yet history's narrative favored the man who moved faster, risked more, and captured attention with audacity. The Rhine crossings, Oppenheim and Wesel, became emblematic not just of military skill but of contrasting philosophies. Patton's aggressive improvisation symbolized American flexibility and determination. Montgomery's deliberate planning reflected British professionalism and caution. Both were necessary to achieve Allied objectives, but the world would remember the flashier triumph, the man who crossed the river at night and claimed victory before the grand spectacle could unfold. As Europe's heartland lay open, the rivalry between the two commanders defined the final push. It shaped public perception, influenced Allied strategy, and left a legacy of tactical innovation and operational audacity. Their personalities, methods, and philosophies were more than personal traits, they were instruments that molded the course of history. And in the shadows of Germany's collapsing defenses, one truth became undeniable. Victory was not only about meticulous planning or daring improvisation. It was about timing, perception, and the ability to seize the moment when the opportunity presented itself. Patton and Montgomery, through conflict and contrast, had illustrated this lesson with unmatched clarity. April 16, 1945. The final phase of the Allied advance into Germany was underway. Patton's Third Army continued its rapid push across southern Germany, while Montgomery's 21st Army Group pressed northward toward the industrial Ruhr. By this time, the Rhine crossings had become more than tactical maneuvers, they symbolized the very essence of Allied cooperation, tension, and contrasting military philosophies. Patton's style, bold and relentless, had carried the day in public perception. Across the Atlantic, newspapers celebrated the audacious night crossing at Oppenheim, highlighting minimal casualties, rapid success, and his theatrical flair. Soldiers admired his decisiveness, and journalists eagerly captured every dramatic gesture, from paratroopers landing under fire to Patton's now famous act of scooping up German soil at the East Bank. Yet for Montgomery, the glory was bittersweet. He had orchestrated the largest river crossing in history at Wesel with unprecedented coordination, yet the headlines favored the man who had crossed first, improvised, and captured the imagination of the public. Behind the scenes, tensions lingered. Montgomery, known for his disciplined professionalism, privately complained about what he saw as American ostentation. "They cannot resist drawing attention to themselves," he remarked. Patton, on the other hand, never wavered in his view of Montgomery's methodical approach. In his diary, he wrote, "Monty wants certainty before acting. I'd rather take a calculated risk and force results." Their philosophical divide, caution versus audacity, had driven both commanders to remarkable achievements, but also fueled a rivalry that shaped the narrative of Allied success. Despite personal differences, both men achieved extraordinary results in April 1945. Patton's Third Army advanced over 600 miles from Normandy, liberating towns, capturing over 1 million prisoners, and effectively dismantling the German army in southern and central regions. Montgomery, with the 21st Army Group, secured northern Germany, captured strategic cities, and positioned Allied forces for the final drive to the Baltic. The operational differences were stark. Patton moved fast, adapted constantly, and accepted higher risks, while Montgomery moved methodically, ensuring minimal casualties and precise coordination. Yet both strategies were essential to the Allied victory, demonstrating that multiple approaches could complement each other in a vast coalition war. By late April, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin from multiple directions, the rivalry had faded into professional acknowledgement, though personal views remained unchanged. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, had managed the delicate balance between two strong personalities. In private, he praised both, understanding that Patton's audacity had captured public attention, while Montgomery's careful planning had ensured long-term strategic success. In his memoirs, Eisenhower reflected that the Rhine crossings and subsequent advances illustrated the importance of both improvisation and discipline in modern warfare. May 4, 1945. German forces in northern Germany surrendered to Montgomery's army, while Patton's Third Army continued consolidating control in central and southern regions. The war in Europe was nearing its end, with surrender imminent. The Rhine crossings, both at Oppenheim and Wesel, had proven decisive in opening Germany's heartland to Allied forces. Yet, beyond military outcomes, they became symbols of leadership style, national military culture, and public perception. Post-war assessments would reflect these differences. American historians lauded Patton's tactical brilliance, his capacity to exploit opportunities, and his relentless drive. They emphasized the importance of speed, initiative, and audacity in achieving rapid victory. British historians highlighted Montgomery's meticulous planning, strategic foresight, and minimal casualties, arguing that careful preparation ensured the enduring success of operations like plunder. The Rhine crossings, while temporally close, were conducted under vastly different circumstances: terrain, enemy strength, and objectives, yet the narrative often focused on who crossed first, capturing the tension between perception and reality. Montgomery himself, in his post-war memoirs, acknowledged Patton's effectiveness. He described the Oppenheim crossing as a demonstration of dash and leadership, even if he could not fully endorse the theatrical and impulsive methods employed. Patton, conversely, never softened his critique of Montgomery, maintaining that excessive caution risked lost opportunities. This philosophical divide, careful planning versus audacious action, became a defining lens through which military scholars would later evaluate both men. By May 8, 1945, VE Day, Europe celebrated the collapse of Nazi Germany. Patton's and Montgomery's armies had both contributed decisively to victory. The Rhine crossings were historical milestones, one emblematic of bold American improvisation, the other of disciplined British professionalism. Together, they demonstrated that success in war required both speed and strategy, audacity and meticulous execution. The legacy of the rivalry endured beyond the battlefield. Patton became a symbol of American courage, risk-taking, and flamboyance, while Montgomery was celebrated as the epitome of British organization, prudence, and methodical skill. Public memory often highlighted Patton's dramatic crossings, but military analysis recognized Montgomery's strategic foresight. Both men had, in their own ways, shaped the outcome of the final Allied advance into Germany and influenced generations of military thought. In the end, the Rhine became more than a river, it became a metaphor. It represented the meeting point of two philosophies, two national cultures, and two brilliant but contrasting commanders. Patton's audacity versus Montgomery's meticulousness, American improvisation versus British precision, the headlines versus the quiet, calculated victories. History would remember both, yet the Rhine crossings ensured that their rivalry was forever etched into the annals of military legend. Two great commanders, two approaches to war, one river. And in the end, victory belonged to both.